it's important that members of Congress understand the challenges of starting and running a small business in our community. When I talk about the Navy, a lot of times it sounds like I'm talking about ships and steel and machinery and the weapon systems that I operated. But that's not what the Navy's about. The Navy's about the people. And my job as a leader in the Navy was to create an environment for the people, for the sailors to succeed. The job of a representative is the same, to create an environment for people and families in our communities to succeed. And what that means is we need to ensure access to quality, affordable health care. We need to protect Social Security and Medicare. We need to champion our environment and the Chesapeake Bay. We need to invest in education and a workforce to grow our economy. And we need to ensure that our troops have the resources they need and our veterans have the benefits that they were promised. I'm excited to talk about these issues and how I'll bring that mission-driven approach that I learned in the Navy and that I apply in my business to represent you in Washington. And I look forward to the discussion today.
Opening statement from Scott Taylor.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you to the Chamber for having us. Thank you, Bruce, for having us here in this beautiful hotel. I just want to say it's an honor to represent all of you. And I also want to say a couple years ago, I was walking through the Capitol, and I was lost. I'm lost all the time still. And I looked up at the ceiling, and there was a quote. And the quote said, "You are the rulers and the ruled." And when you think about that in the context of democracy, it's very powerful. So I'm always mindful that in this position, you are my rulers. And I will tell you that a couple years ago, I told you that I was going to work to rebuild our military, and we've done just that. I told you a couple years ago I was going to work to take care of our veterans, and we've done just that. I told you a couple years ago that I would work and vote in a way that sets the conditions to thrive in this economy, and that's exactly what's happening. I told you I'd work across the aisle, and we have. Every bill, every one that I have introduced has a Democrat co-sponsor. I told you I'd be an independent voice, and when I felt like it's appropriate or necessary, I've stood up against my party, but I've retained their respect and still been able to work with them. Now, I want to continue to represent you, because I understand that you are my rulers in this position, but I also want to work hard. I told you I'd work hard and relentless to be able to get things done, and that's exactly what we've done. I told you a couple years ago that I was going to vote to repeal and replace Obamacare. While it has some good provisions and it does help some people, I felt like it hurts more than it helps. Skyrocketing premiums and skyrocketing deductibles, all of you are very well aware of that. I told you I was going to vote to lower your taxes because Americans were paying more taxes than in the history of this nation. And the vast majority of folks in here voted to send me to Washington to represent them, to include my opponent, who voted for me not once but twice in the Republican primary as well as the general election. I want to continue my hard work for you, and I can't wait to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question goes to Elaine Luria. Supporters of the recent tax cut hold that it's produced jobs, raised wages, catalyzed the stock market, and built confidence in the economy. Opponents maintain the benefits have been skewed to the wealthy and large corporations while juicing the deficit to a record level. What's your position on the tax cuts, and how can federal economic policy strengthen the second district economy?
Well, my position on the tax cuts is that it's completely irresponsible for our government to incur $1.9 trillion in debt over the next 10 years on the backs of our children and our grandchildren. And like you mentioned in the question that you phrased, 83% of the benefits from those tax cuts go to the wealthy. And why would we cut taxes on corporations when corporations are experiencing record profits? I can tell you that across this campaign, I've been all over the district, from Chincoteague and Wachapreague down to Sandbridge and Pungo and up to Williamsburg and everywhere in between in Norfolk and Virginia Beach. There are a lot of people in our community who are really struggling to get by. They are working 2 jobs just to put a roof over their head, provide clothing and food for their children. And we have given a modest tax cut to middle-class individuals. The average for 99% of the people is $688 a year. For the top 1%, it's $55,000 a year. So I think that we need to seriously look at where our values are as far as the tax cuts that we have given to individuals. And you ask what we can do to grow Hampton Roads and grow our economy. We have issues here in Hampton Roads. We need to tackle the effects of sea level rise and recurrent flooding. We need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to invest in our children's education. But how can we do that as a nation when we voluntarily take a $1.9 trillion cut in revenue? Does it make any sense to pass this tax bill and we have a 1% increase in revenue this year and a 7% increase in spending? And our deficit is just ballooning. Next year, it's projected to be over $1 trillion. So I think that we need to have true fiscal responsibility in Washington. We need to make legislation a reflection of our values so that we value the investments in our community and our infrastructure that will actually grow our economy.
2 minutes for Scott Taylor.
Well, let me say I value your investment in this economy right now, because I look around the room and I see a lot of investment in this economy. I see Cox. I've heard Huntington Ingalls, who have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in our economy, Dollar Tree, Walmart, McDonald's, who have made investments in wages, in bonuses, in the community, in education. So I think the tax reform spurred a lot of investment in our community. And I will also say this. I grew up working poor on the Delmarva Peninsula, raised by a single mother, 4 kids in the house. So I can tell you right now that $688, if in fact that number's correct, could be the difference between the lights going on or off. I was in Froggy's Cantina. Some of you have been in there probably too many times. And you know, people come around me all the time and talk to me about this. 9 out of 10 folks in this district have seen more money in their own pockets. And I had a single mother who came up to me, which resonated personally with me. And that's exactly what she said. I'm getting $70 more in my paycheck every 2 weeks. And it almost made me cry because I know her struggles, because my own mom had that. So I can tell you right now that the tax reform has helped 9 out of 10 folks in this community with more money in their pocket, and it's absolutely helped you in your business, and I know that because I've talked to many of you. As my opponent said, she's gone around the district. Well, so have I for years and worked with many of you. So I know the benefit of that tax reform here, and I'm proud to have supported it.
Thank you. 1 minute.
Well, I think that the one thing I didn't mention in the 2 minutes I had before is that, you know, in the tax bill, it also repealed the individual mandate. And what has that done to healthcare costs? Healthcare costs are going up. Premiums are already rising by approximately 10%. So the amount more that people are paying in healthcare costs is far eclipsing the modest tax savings that they're receiving. So, you know, I don't think that people are fooled by this tax bill. $1.9 trillion additional dollars in debt. And leadership in Congress, Paul Ryan, who's coming here to campaign for my opponent this week, has said that for every dollar that we took in a cut in revenue in this tax bill, we're going to take an equivalent cut in Social Security and Medicare. And he has himself said that what that means is let's just tweak around the edges a little bit. Would you like to work an extra 5 to 10 years because we need to tweak around the edges and raise the age at which you start receiving Social Security? I don't think anyone would agree to that.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question now that's a follow-up to that, and that's, I was going to say, Senate Leader Mitch McConnell recently stated that the federal deficit's a major challenge and that adjustments might have to be made in Social Security and Medicare to get the deficit under control. It's a question for Scott Taylor. Do you concur with McConnell's statement? And if not, how would you address the growing deficit?
So let me first address something that I'm not sure Paul Ryan said that. You guys can check it out for yourself. But what I will say is an individual mandate, which I thought was unconstitutional, and clearly the Obama administration thought it was too. And that's why they argued that it was a tax and not something that was forcing you to buy something that you might not necessarily want to buy. And furthermore, there's over 1 million people have more insurance since we repealed that individual mandate. So let's make sure that we're talking about facts. Now, what I want to talk about my position in Medicare and Social Security. Number one, I have co-sponsored legislation that will put a lockbox on Social Security because it is our money. As you heard when I came in here with my bio, I've been working since I was 11 years old. 11, paying Social Security. So I want it to be there when I'm of age. Now, I think it is important. It is important for us to look at it, for Congress to make tough decisions. And I want to say this because there's tis the season. There's all kinds of crazy ads out there. But the reality is those are on an unsustainable path. And because they're mandatory spending, it basically stops Congress from taking the tough decisions to even look at them, to even say, hey, my generation, not the generation that's worried about it right now, which, again, we've been falsely accused and attacked of rating Medicare and rating Social Security for that generation. That is completely false. But I do think that in my generation, we will have to look at it. We'll be forced to look at it. And everyone in Washington knows that. Everyone. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican or independent, you know that it's on an unsustainable path. that it's 60% of our government budget, and it's growing. So I do think that over time we'll have to look at it in my generation to make the tough decisions and be leaders so that we can make sure that it's solvent and it's there when we come of age.
2 minutes for Elaine Luria.
Thank you. Well, let's be clear. Social Security and Medicare are earned benefits. I have worked hard my entire life. You have worked hard your entire life, and you have paid in to Social Security and Medicare. Social Security was designed to allow people to retire in dignity. 1/3 of people receiving Social Security and Medicare would be living below the poverty line if we did not have these social safety net programs that our seniors depend on and have depended on for generations to be able to retire in dignity. My opponent has proposed a so-called lockbox to Social Security. And I can tell you that a lockbox is not going to do a lot of good when it's empty, because there is no surplus in Social Security. So these are critical programs, and we need to ensure that we continue to maintain these for future generations.
1 minute for Scott Taylor.
Just one quick one. Of course, a lockbox is no good if there's no money in it. Of course. But the reality is we have to make sure that we make sure it's solvent for my generation. I do think there should be a lockbox on it, just like we think that there should be a lockbox on transportation funds in the state and the capital. So I 100% support that, and I'm proud to support it.
Okay, great. The issue of pre-existing conditions, this is for Elaine Luria, has become central to the health care debate. The Affordable Care Act provides for coverage that does not permit insurance companies to charge higher rates for individuals with pre-existing conditions. Do you support continuation of this policy? And if not, how would you propose that pre-existing conditions be addressed?
I most certainly do support coverage for people with pre-existing conditions, and I recall about 560 or so days ago when my opponent had his only series of 3 town halls, which he did say he would have once a quarter or more if necessary, and since has said it wasn't his job to be in front of people and answer their questions in a public forum. He said, he stood up and he said that he would never vote for anything that removed coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. He subsequently voted for the AHCA, which removes coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. And you may have heard in his ads against me that that's false, that's a lie. But you don't have to ask me. You can ask the AARP, the American Heart Association, and about 24 other organizations of medical professionals that 100% agree that the AHCA would have removed coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. And why is that? It would have made coverage so expensive that people with pre-existing conditions would not have been able to afford the coverage. And moreover, through removing the individual mandate in the recent tax bill, it essentially dismantles what supports the Affordable Care Act. And 45,400 people in this district alone receive their health care through the Affordable Care Act. My opponent is perfectly happy to vote to take away health care from over 45,000 of his constituents.
That's a nice comment, but it's just not true. AARP, they make money in insurance. They make money. Of course they come out. Let's hear from someone else. How about the American College of Cardiologists? They're encouraged by the widely expressed commitment to guarantee access to affordable coverage options for patients with heart disease or other pre-existing conditions. That's in support of the AHCA. Let's hear what the Chamber says. The U.S. Chamber is standing behind the American Health Care Act to be voted in the House of Representatives this week. They have concerns. While the Chamber recognizes that further improvements need to be made, passage of this legislation is absolutely critical to restore choice, flexibility, and innovation to America's healthcare markets. I have people with pre-existing conditions in my own family. That's crazy that we wouldn't try to protect them. I actually signed or co-sponsored legislation that would mandate that we do just that. So what my goal is in healthcare is to make it more affordable for everyone and take care of folks who can't help themselves. But I think, to be fair, that the ACA, which I think is failing, and the AHCA didn't go far enough in transparency and competition. If you need a hip replacement, you should be able to go to him and him and him and figure out, if they're all doctors, how much they cost. What does it cost the insurance? Are they any good or not? Like, we need to have that ability. There's new technology that is, well, quite frankly, the healthcare market is ripe for disruption, but it gets boxed out. Bon Secours. Bon Secours currently, right now, they have a standalone spot right here in Virginia Beach. They do the same type of surgery that a hospital does, and they get reimbursed half the price. How does that make sense? They also have techniques to be able to make things less invasive and faster, but it takes forever to get them through CMS for reimbursement. We've got to move faster than that to reduce health care for everyone, create transparency, create accountability, create competition, so we reduce the cost for everyone. But the notion that I'm not fighting for folks with pre-existing conditions is ridiculous.
1 minute.
Well, when we talk about the AHCA, I really like to reflect on the fact about why that is not our current law. The one person in the Senate who stood up and voted against the AHCA was Senator John McCain. And if you look back at his original vote, he didn't vote for the Affordable Care Act in the first place. But Senator McCain knew that this was the right answer, and the right answer for our country, and the right answer to cover people with pre-existing conditions. And he, someone I've always admired as a fellow graduate of the Naval Academy, someone who served our country in uniform, was a prisoner of war, and served honorably in the Senate for many years. He knew what it was to put country over party. We should beg my opponent to have done that at least once. He's voted 98% of the time along party lines. And we need more leaders like Senator John McCain who are willing to put country over party and not solely fall in line with their leadership.
I've got to give you the question.
Oh, come on. Really?
We have one more health care question I'd like to add. The high price of prescription drugs is a major factor in the uncertainty that citizens in Hampton Roads feel about the health care system. Do you support proposals that would enable the federal government to negotiate Medicare drug prices and allow for the importation of drugs manufactured in other countries?
I gotta respond to that. Sorry, and then we'll get to that. Number one, when you look at healthcare deductibles from 2008, which averaged around $300, and now they're over $1,300, which is a mortgage payment for some folks, and certainly the rent. There's been one major healthcare thing that's happened in the last decade, and what is it? It's the Non-Affordable Care Act that's come in. So it's very clear what has made our health premiums and deductibles rise. Some people are walking around with insurance cards, and they have no coverage because they can't afford the deductibles. So we have to get it under control. The 98% voting with the president, that shows either intentional misleading or a lack of understanding of how our system actually works. If someone out in the audience can show me or raise your hand and tell me one bill that the president or the administration has submitted for me to vote on, please raise your hand, because there are 0 bills that have come from the administration. The 98% thing is because our party's in power. The House of Representatives is a majoritarian House. So if Nancy Pelosi gets in power, then you can bet if my opponent won, she'd be voting for Nancy Pelosi 98% of the time. So ask yourselves if you want that. But that talking point, which is exactly what it is intentionally misleading, or it shows an ignorance of the system. Now, what was the question?
Prescription drugs.
I think we should work to do anything we can to reduce drug prices, including the gag order, which was by the administration, which I do support. I can put that in the 98% thing. But I think it's important that we absolutely reduce bills. So I'm open to any idea for that.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I absolutely agree that we should reduce prescription drug costs. And when I look at prescription drug costs, the rising cost of prescription drugs, the rising cost of health care, there's one thing I always go back to, and I think that there are many obstacles to cutting prescription drug costs. And I think that's because the leadership in Congress, who's there to vote on this and bring this legislation to the floor, they're accepting thousands, if not millions of dollars from prescription drug companies. And I can tell you that a key tenet in my campaign is that I am not accepting any corporate PAC contributions, not from prescription drug companies, not from oil companies, not from healthcare companies, not from private prisons, not from anyone who can influence my vote when I go to Washington. My door is open to listen to everyone, but I don't need their money in order to do that.
1 minute.
Yeah, sure. Again, that comment shows either one, intentional misleading, or a lack of understanding, because I can bet you that $5 million that has come in this district that paints me out to be a racist and a sexist and a criminal and all the whatever other name that you can come up with, guess where that money's coming from? Corporations who give to Nancy Pelosi's PAC, who then spends in this district. So you can bet that you're not, maybe not directly taking corporate money in your campaign, but you certainly are benefiting from it. There's no question about that.
Next question for Elaine Luria. President Trump's raised tariff on a number of countries for the purpose of addressing what he considers unfair trade practices and increasing American jobs. Do you believe that increased tariffs are good for the Hampton Roads economy and jobs in this district?
Well, I do not think that increased tariffs are good for this region. Let's just look at how important trade is to this region. We have the Port of Virginia. 1 out of every 9 jobs in the Commonwealth is directly or indirectly tied to the port. We have $13 billion of imports and exports going just through the Port of Virginia with our trade partner of China. And we're the 3rd largest port on the East Coast by container volume. So trade is very important to this area. And we have to remember the rural and agricultural areas of the district as well, soybean farmers and poultry farmers on the Eastern Shore. So these tariffs are detrimental to this region if it escalates into a trade war that's out of control. You know, I have a small business and we manufacture our product. And I just got a letter the other day from one of my main suppliers. I have 3 main components that go into the product that I manufacture. And the steel tariffs are hitting me in my small 2-location retail business that does about $500,000 in sales a year. It's going to hit me. And my main supplier, Hillman, located in Ohio, is going to pass those tariffs on to me for the steel that I put into my product, a small 4 3/8-inch galvanized steel rod. I'm going to be paying more for that. And I'm sure that many other people and many businesses in this room are going to be paying more as well for the components that they use to manufacture their products. And look at the stock market today. Caterpillar, that went down and the whole market followed. And what was the reason? Increased tariffs on steel and aluminum. So it is going to be detrimental to the consumer and to manufacturers in this community and across the country. And we cannot afford to have an uncontrolled trade war just to strong-arm trade partners who are our neighbors and our strongest allies. It makes no sense with Canada whatsoever.
2 minutes?
Well, thank you. I wish we had more time than 2 minutes. But I would say that anything that happens in trade, any decision that's made, it does hurt some people and help folks. So it has to be looked at, and you have to do it with a scalpel as opposed to a baseball bat. But the reality is there's been 3, if not 4 presidents who have, and administrations who have talked about trade, who have talked about the problems with NATO. It needs to be of NAFTA, of China. China's the biggest one, right, who have been stealing IP and manipulating their currency and cheating on trade. Everyone in the world knows that, by the way. So this president was the first one to step up and really work hard to do it, you know, to deal with this problem. And I come from an area, I mean, my opponent mentioned the farms and poultry. Well, I've shoveled a lot of chicken poop in my day, I can tell you that right now, growing up on the Eastern Shore. So I talk to farmers, and they understand, and they're concerned about the soybeans, rightfully so, but they also understand what the president is trying to do long term. And whether you're in economic war, Cold War, or hot war, things are uncertain. Any decision you make is uncertain. And with respect to China, we look at that huge wealth transfer that they've had, and what are they doing with it? Spending it right on the military, spending it to gain influence around the world. And I don't mean to paint China as, you know, the boogeyman. That's not what I mean, because it's in our best interest to have a stable China, not a super weak China. But at the same time, they're spending their monies to be able to defeat the United States militarily speaking. And there's a scholar from Harvard who writes about the Thucydides trap. And more often than not, through history, he talks about that a rising power ends up in hot conflict with a status quo power. Now, anything that we can do to reduce the trajectory of military spending in China, I think is a positive thing. And as somebody who has been to war, and has many people who have been to war, and has listened to Amazing Grace played on the bagpipes many, many times, if we can deal with this economically and not hot, then I'm all for it.
Mm-hmm. 1 minute?
Well, I think what's most obvious to me is that it's Congress's job to enforce trade policy. And the fact that the president is using executive overreach and a national security clause to invoke these tariffs is absolutely absurd, especially with Canada and Mexico. And, you know, I think that my opponent may have forgotten that I also served for 20 years in the military.
No, I didn't forget.
Deployed 6 times to the Middle East and Western Pacific, commanded a combat unit of 400 sailors. I have been to China. I've been to Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong as the aide to the commander of the 7th Fleet. I've visited with the highest levels of the Chinese military and understood their considerations for their operations in the Western Pacific. And I could go on. Sorry, we don't have more time for me to, you know, expound on my experience in the Western Pacific and China's military forces. But I think that it is irresponsible to implement these tariffs.
Okay. 2 minutes question for Scott Taylor. Immigration, as we've seen from the president's recent comments on the 7,000-person caravan that began in Honduras, remains one of the most controversial issues in American politics. Where do you stand on the caravan, and what do you think is the most beneficial immigration policy for the economy in this region?
Okay, how much time do we got? 2 minutes. Let me first say this. I've spent years of my life outside of this country. I spent years all throughout South and Central America. I spent years in the Middle East, on the ground, and dealing with communities and dealing with militaries as well. I understand why folks want to come here, and I'm damn proud that they do, that we are that shining city on the hill, that folks want to come here and better their lives and raise their kids and get a better education and make money, of course. I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. But you also have to do it right. You have to do it right. And we have swearing-in ceremonies right here in Norfolk where folks, my son's mother is an immigrant, now an American citizen, who went through the process, who spent the money and the paperwork and the time to be able to get processed correctly. So I, as a member of the Appropriations Committee who oversees Homeland Security, one of my first trips as a congressman was to the border to understand it, to understand every sector of the border, and to speak to folks that are Customs and Border Patrol folks there, and to talk about the cartels, which I already had a little bit of experience at counter-drug stuff when I was in the SEAL teams. But I will tell you that there is more need for border security in terms of technology, some physical wall, as well as people. But the reality is, and for this community, some of the other immigration, like the visas that help folks in the agriculture industry, in the shellfish industry, and the construction industry, they're getting swept up in that. And we have been an advocate to make sure that we have enough workforce here, because it is hurting some of our industries. And some people will say, well, that takes American jobs. No, to the contrary, it actually produces American jobs in some industries. So I think we need more border security. I think we do need better laws. I'm not, again, you can't just come in here. You just can't come in here. You have to do it right. You have to do it legally and lawfully. And I was in a hearing when Democrats who put forth amendments that would have created safe zones in the United States for people who just made it across the border, rights that you don't enjoy as American citizens, and I think that's wrong.
2 minutes.
Well, on the subject of immigration, I spent 20 years defending our country and helping protect our borders. I think that it's a false narrative. We do not have to make a choice between strong borders and an immigration system that works. We can and we should have both, and that's the responsibility of Congress. We need comprehensive immigration reform. And current Congress does not have the will to make that happen. I can just tell you a story about my own family who came here at the beginning of the 20th century. They came from what's now Poland, ended up in a very small town in Alabama, traveled around the countryside as peddlers selling goods to coal miners in Walker County. And they grew that into a brick and mortar store in Jasper, Alabama, where they were pillars of the community, opened a synagogue, built a synagogue there. And over generations, my grandfather served in the military and became a doctor. And over generations, my family, and just like many of you in this room, this is the American dream that our families lived over the course of generations. My family from the late 19th century to the early 20th century coming here, and different people. It might be first generation or much longer, but we have lived this American dream. And this is what America stands for to me. And how did that happen? It's because we had an immigration system that worked. And we need to have comprehensive immigration reform and have people willing to go to Congress, work across the aisle, and make that happen in a way that works for our communities and supports as well those workers who want to come here with visas. This current limitation on visas is hurting our hotel industry. It's hurting the farmers on the Eastern Shore. It's hurting the high-tech industry and brain power in our universities. So we need comprehensive immigration reform that covers all of these areas.
1 minute.
I don't think there's anyone in this room who agrees with someone else 100% of the time, period. So I think she's right. You do have to come there willing to Congress to actually get things done. I will tell you that I led against my party and got a primary election for it, because I wanted to protect those folks who are in the DACA population. Every single hearing that I was in Homeland Security, I talked about those visas that I know that industry needs, that I know that right here in this district that they need. But we also need border security. And you do have to have willing partners on both sides. You do not have willing partners on both sides right now. There are numerous videos out there, if you Google them, of many Democrats, prominent and not prominent, speaking about border security, speaking about they have to do the right thing, come the right way. Never before, when they were in power, they were talking about it was acceptable to have a caravan of 7,000 people who just come here. Or to not detain any pregnant women or to have safe zones and like bus stops for immigrants. That stuff is irresponsible. And there aren't willing partners on the other side as well. But I can tell you, I've led on this effort, and to the detriment of myself and my own party.
Okay, thanks. Let me follow up a little bit on this conversation.
I wish I had more time.
And this is for Elaine Luria. In terms of immigration policy, would you support changes in the system that we currently have now that would lead to a skills-based or a merit-based system on immigration?
I think that, like I described the American dream for my family, I think that we need people with skills, and we also need people who have the ambition and willingness to come here and work hard. Immigrants create more patents than anyone else in our community. The crime rate among immigrants is lower than among native-born Americans, and all of this fear that my opponent wants to stoke into
That's
it
not true.
about immigration is just not true. I think that people who are willing to give up everything they have in their country come here with just their suitcases and establish a new life and a new future for their family. I think that people deserve that across all spectrums of education and professional experience. But, you know, as a country, we need to bring those people here who are going to help our businesses. I've been up on the peninsula and talked to the folks at Jefferson Lab, the people at universities, at Old Dominion, and at Virginia Wesleyan. And, you know, some of the people who come here as immigrants, both as students and faculty, they add so much to our educational system and to our economy and to our community. So I think that it needs to be the correct mix of all types of skills.
Okay. Yeah.
So much like some of these ads that you're seeing, I don't think anyone in this room has ever heard me fear-mongering about immigrants. That is ridiculous and wrong. I've spent years of my life outside this country. Every single country that is more prosperous than the one next to it in the world has an immigration problem. In Yemen, when I spent years in Yemen, they had an immigration problem from Ethiopia, and there aren't any jobs in Yemen. So everyone that's more prosperous next to the country that is not has immigration issues. But you have a country, and you have borders, and you have laws. And I will tell you that, number one, it's not just skilled workers, that's true, but we need crab pickers and folks that are working in the poultry industry and folks that are working in the tourism industry. So I think that you can have a comprehensive immigration system if you have people who are willing to work in a bipartisan manner, which I have. Which I've actually led the charge, again, to the detriment of myself politically, to be able to get something done. But that's the reality, because there are people who want to come here to better themselves, and I would never fear-monger for that at all. But you have to do it the right way. And I do want to, I have a little bit of time, so I'll talk about this hearing that I'm in. So I'm in the Homeland hearing, and the Democrats, many of them who have said that they support responsible border security and law and stuff like that, they put forth 2 amendments. One amendment says that ICE or Border Control could not detain any pregnant women. Any pregnant women. They were illegal or whatever from the border. Is there any woman in here that if you have done something outside the law that you can't be detained? No. Those are rights that we don't give our own citizens. And then one other one, it was a gentleman, and he put forth a place that had sensitive places that ICE and Border Patrol and Customs couldn't apprehend anyone. And it was a list of like 60. And it wasn't like synagogues or mosques or churches. It was bus stops. And it's at 1,000 feet from any of them. And I asked him, I'm like, is there any place in your district where if someone's illegal, they could be apprehended? And the answer is no. We don't do that for our own citizens. We can't do it for someone who's not a citizen.
1 minute.
Thank you. Well, I think that I will remind you again, Mr. Taylor, that I served for 20 years in the military, protecting our borders and keeping our nation safe. And that you would imply that I do not believe in strong borders, that you would imply that I do not believe in enforcing our laws is just simply wrong. And I think that, you know, people who violated our trust by committing crimes, we need to send those people home. But we need to have an immigration system that brings people here who will benefit our communities, who will help grow our economy, and they have the right to come here and live out the American dream.
Okay. Mr. Taylor, 2 minutes. Sequestration, as everyone knows, had a very negative impact on the Hampton Roads economy, and it's only now beginning to recover. What steps do you think need to be taken to ensure that the federal government can take to ensure that job creation in this region can begin to accomplish what so many of the people in this room want to see?
I got 2 minutes. So sequestration was something that I told you that I was going to work opposing. that I told you that I was going to try to get Congress back to regular order. Now, I know this is a low bar, but for the first time in like 22 years, Congress has passed the appropriations and authorization for defense, and first time in 22 years. That's because of veterans and freshman congressmen who worked really hard, opposed to leadership and what their mindset was. But we were able to get to sequestration pushed back. We were able to get regular order this year, which helps our maintenance and our readiness and our training. It doesn't hurt. It helps get us back on a cycle, because once you defer ship maintenance, it's more expensive for taxpayers. It has a cascading negative effect. It increases the time for deployments, which hurts our backbone of our military, which are strong military families. So those are things that I've worked on. We were able to fully fund our defense. We got the largest pay raise in almost 10 years for our military folks. So we're rebuilding our military. I promised you I would do that, and I've been working with folks like the Admiral over there to make sure that happens. What I've also been able to do, because I am on the Appropriations Committee, again, and I'll say it again, the first one ever in the history of Virginia, we have helped to bring hundreds of millions of dollars back to this economy, and not frivolous spending, but needed maintenance for readiness, for construction, for the military bases that are around here. So we've worked hard to make sure that happens. But I will tell you, and you've heard me say it before, that long term, we do have to get a handle on some of military spending. The Army will tell you, Army, go Navy, will tell you they spend $500 million a year in empty bases. $500 million a year in empty buildings. That's unacceptable. We have to deal with it. So short term, we needed that cash injection for maintenance and readiness and training for our military. But long term, we do have to get a handle on it. We have to audit, which that's also taking place, an audit of DOD, to make sure that we're being responsible with your tax dollars for the military.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I think we all know the importance of the military on our economy. 42% of our economy in the Hampton Roads region is directly or indirectly tied to Navy and DoD assets. We have bases from every service in this district. We have the Department of Energy, we have NASA, and all of these things are driven by federal spending, and our economy fluctuates with federal spending in the district. And I've lived through sequestration. I was the executive officer on a guided missile cruiser, the USS Anzio. We had a crack 14 feet long and 2 feet wide at the largest width in our hangar bay. We had deferred maintenance and docking for 10 years, and we still got underway, and we deployed with our South American neighbors for a UNITAS deployment. And this is how we're asking our troops to deploy and operate. And that is not always safe, it's not always good for readiness, and it certainly is not good for our local economy with the fluctuations in the ship repair and maintenance sector. But what I really want to focus on is growing the economy in Hampton Roads. So I had a great conversation with Brian Stevens about what can we do to grow the economy. And I've talked to economic development folks in Norfolk and Virginia Beach. The one question that I always ask is, what can we do to diversify our economy here in Hampton Roads? What are our barriers to bringing new industry here? And they always say it's that we don't have a trained and ready workforce to fill these jobs, whether they be STEM jobs, whether they be trade jobs. I sat down with the president of Newport News Shipbuilding. She's hiring 455 people a week, but there's not that many electricians and welders and pipe fitters sitting around Hampton Roads. And we need to invest in these types of jobs, these middle skill, middle wage jobs that do not require a college degree. And we need to make sure that our young people have those skills so that they can have well-paying jobs. And we can bring people out of poverty, we can grow our economy, and diversify our economy.
1 minute.
Oh, perfect. So I agree. Obviously, it's a huge. It's one of the State of the Region said it's one of the pillars of our economy, our military. And my opponent actually sent out an email demanding a Clean Dream Act, and the folks that demanded a Clean Dream Act didn't vote for that to take care of our military to fully fund it. So all the Democrats who were demanding a Clean Dream Act voted against that. I have the email right here. But I think it is important, and as I've talked to Brian and many businesses, of course, that you do have a problem with the skilled labor force, that we're cannibalizing our own labor force. So what can we do about that? Well, let's talk about a couple things that I'm doing or have done. I've submitted legislation. It's called the Pro-Pell Act. So in the Pell Grant system, it doesn't have flexibility for folks to be able to get certifications for machinists or coders or welders. It pushes them to a 2 or 4 year degree, which is fine. But if someone wants to get into the workforce, they need to be able to get that hand up to get into it right now. And now I'm out of time, so I'll finish on the next question.
This question goes to Elaine Luria. I'd like to turn to foreign policy for 1 minute. I think it's fair to say that almost no one believes the cover story put forward by the Saudi government about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi citizen residing in Virginia, How should American foreign policy respond to this murder? And more generally, should human rights considerations take precedence over economic interests?
Well, I think that we have been allies with the Saudis. We have military operations with the Saudis around the world, but we should never place that alliance with Saudi Arabia over a human rights crime that we believe to have been committed. But it's just that. It's not been proven. We need to get to the bottom of an investigation, intelligence investigation, to determine exactly what happened. But all things are leaning in the direction that this seems like there's compelling evidence that about 18 Saudis went to Turkey and that they murdered this man in the consulate. But one thing to talk about with this is that I don't think the diplomacy surrounding this should be done via Twitter and tweets. And I think that we are escalating the situation. We are potentially aggravating allies or people who need to be with us on determining what happened in this situation. And I think that we need to continue to be a beacon for human rights. So we need to stand up for human rights. This type of atrocity is unacceptable. And this brings me back to talk about the authorization of use of military force, because we do operate around the world with Saudi Arabia in many places. And should we continue those operations with them as our ally if they are engaging in this type of human rights abuse? And my opponent has frequently said that he believes in renewing the authorization of the use of military force. But to my knowledge, during his year and a half or so in office, he hasn't stood up in any way or introduced any legislation or anything to really question where we have our troops on the ground around the world. 42 countries, I think, was the most recent number.
So
2 minutes?
So we'll have to start off on the AUMF. The AUMF is over 17 years old now. It's been used by 3 different presidents. I do think it's in Congress's purview that we should renew that and reauthorize that. And in fact, I did stand up in the appropriations hearing, and it was because I stood up that that amendment passed through appropriations, because I stood up and spoke up for it. So I do believe that we should be redoing that, because I still have, just like you do, friends that are still serving that around, that are bearing the brunt of the wars in the last 17 years, and their families. So I do think that we should be looking all over the world geopolitically where we should be targeting, what we should be doing as a military. So it is important that we review, renew, reauthorize the AUMF, and I absolutely am leading on that effort. Now let's talk about Saudi. So I spent almost 4 years in and out of Yemen. I negotiate with armed tribesmen in the middle of the desert for either to get them to stop hijacking trucks or shooting at us, or some of them just wanted jobs. I'm not sure if you've been to a job interview with their AK-47, but it happens over there. So I understand the culture very well. I've met the king, I've met the crown prince, I've met the leaders in the other countries, surrounding countries, Emir and the crown prince of Abu Dhabi, and I understand the issue very, very well. And it's also important to say this: yes, human rights matter, and there's international. For this, we should also be cautious and understand that MBS is not Saudi Arabia.
1 minute.
Well, I think I'll just point out those words, careful and cautious. And nothing that's been happening about leading our foreign policy through tweets is careful or cautious.
We have time for one last question before the closing statements. And I'm just going to, in the interest of time, ask everybody to spend 2 minutes on it. I'll go first to Mr. Taylor. And that is, throughout America, and particularly in
will tell you that there are some ads out there. You guys, actually, they've been very, very nasty. Some of them have crossed the line. And I can promise you, after this election, after we win, we will resort and look and talk to my lawyer and see what makes sense and what not. Because some of that stuff is defamatory and rose above the level of being knowingly false and maliciously with malicious intent. So we'll look at that. I'm okay with our campaign. I think the only thing attack-wise is, number one, we have talked about Nancy Pelosi. You've seen that. Well, all that money, that nasty money that's coming here, is money that she raised, her PACs, personal donation. I would love to know if you're going to vote for her for Speaker if you are elected or if Nancy wins. But so I am happy with the campaign that we've run. I think it's been very positive, and I think that we'll continue to do that, and I'll continue to represent you in a way with dignity and honor and get things done for you.
2 minutes.
Well, I would beg to differ that Congressman Taylor's campaign has in no way been positive. It takes forging signatures by his paid staff to place a third-party candidate on the ballot in order to make me lose. That is not a positive move, and I believe that he has not taken that seriously. He promised that he would remove anyone from his staff who was involved in that. Well, there are 4 people per his own financial report who he is still paying on his staff, one of whom he gave a raise this last quarter, who by a judge in Richmond, by expert testimony, have been found to be engaged in out-and-out fraud. Not only that, but although I went up on TV several weeks before he did, his very first ad was biographical, and the very next one showed me dancing around in a tiara and as a puppet. I am not anyone's puppet. I served in the military for 20 years. I am not a puppet, and I never will be a puppet. And if he feels insulted by my ads that have been positive about my bio, about how I protect Social Security and Medicare, how I don't agree with the tax cuts that we've had, I would beg to say that he might have quite a thin skin. And so I think that we have run a positive campaign. The ads that I have run from my campaign that are in any way attacking the other side simply point out positions about health care, cutting Social Security, and raising and increasing $1.9 trillion in debt.
I'll give 45 seconds to each candidate to describe what you think should be done to enhance and improve civility.
No, I'd like to respond to that first. Number one, I think this is important for everybody out there. I didn't know anything about any wrongdoing about anyone on my campaign until it came out. And once it did, we fired senior staff immediately. And while she's talking about in your campaign staff or campaign, she understands, I hope she understands, that that is not in real time. So no one who was involved in that with any wrongdoing on our campaign is still with our campaign, period. I'm certainly not proud of that. There's no question about it. And that will never, I promise you, happen again. But I think that there are some, not just misleading ads from the DCCC. The DCCC's lawyers actually said in court that I had anything to do with it. There was no evidence there. But yet, when you look at some of those ads, you think I'm a criminal. You think I'm running from the law right now. Well, you better turn me in and get a reward. I'm right here, right? So I can promise you, DCCC, they're not going to like after we win this election. I can promise you that.
45 seconds.
Thank you. Well, I see your staff member, Scott Weldon, sitting in the back. And when he was asked by the press, did Mr. Taylor know anything about this? His answer was, yeah.
Wrong.
And then, when Mr. Taylor was asked about it again, he said this was a nothing purpose. I have a 9-year-old fourth grader. That's the kind of vocabulary I expect her to use, but not my elected representative. And if the staffers, if you continue to pay them for an entire quarter after approximately the first week of August, you said they would be reduced to your staff, I don't quite understand your business practices in running your campaign as to why you would pay them for an entire quarter if they do not still work for you. By expert testimony before a judge in Richmond, the 4 staffers were found to be engaged in out-and-out fraud, such as forging the signature of Mrs. Ben Kate, who happens to be here with us today as our deceased husband.
And if they did something wrong, they'll be held accountable.
Okay, we're now going to move to closing statements, and Scott Taylor, you're
Sure. I'll be brief. I'll be brief. As I said when I first came in here, a couple years ago, I told you what I was going to do. I told my opponent what I was going to do, and she voted for me twice. My positions have been clear. They've been public. My voting record's been public for years. For years. I've worked with many of you in this room for years to try to help our military, our continue to represent you, to get things done, to work across the aisle, to call out my party if I must, appropriately, but maintain their respect. But it is an honor to serve you. It's been the honor of my life to serve you, and I'd like to continue to work hard for those who rule me and are counting on me. So thank you very much. I'm asking for your vote November 6th. God bless you, and God bless you all. God bless the United States.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I think today and in this campaign, you've seen a difference between myself and my opponent, both in vision and in temperament. I'm a 20-year Navy veteran, a small business owner, and a mother. I'm not a politician, and I've never run for office before. During this campaign, I've put tens of thousands of miles on my car, and I've spoken to people all across the district, but I've listened more than I've talked. And what voters tell me is they're concerned about the rising cost of health care, and they're concerned about this Congress voting to gut their coverage for pre-existing conditions. They're worried about having to work longer because of threats to Social Security. After this Congress added additional $1.9 trillion to our debt. And they're worried that their community as they know it will change, fundamentally change due to sea level rise. These are real problems facing real people in our community. If we want to solve these problems, we need people who will find common ground and put their community and their country over their party. The partisan politics that we have going on in Washington now are not who we are. We are neighbors, and in our neighborhoods, we look out for each other. When people are sick, we take care of them. When trees fall in a storm, we help our neighbors clean up debris. In our churches and mosques and synagogues, we worship together as people of shared faith and shared values. On our bases and on our ships, we work together to accomplish a mission. In our communities, we are not Democrats and Republicans. We are neighbors. We are people who worship together, people who serve together. We are Americans, and we deserve leaders who will bring people together, not drive people apart. When I had command in the Navy, my philosophy was very simple: be good and do good work. My name is Elaine Luria, and I ask for your vote on November 6th so that together we can be good and do good work for people of the Second District.
Thanks very much. I'd like to ask Brian Stevens to come up and conclude our event.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Dr. Bob Molesworth a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Hampton Roads Chamber, I hope that this debate was informative to you so that you can make a better decision 2 weeks from today. I would like to, at this time, thank our candidates and present them, and they both know exactly what this is, present them with the Chamber Challenge coin. Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the debate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, because on the screen it says meeting delayed 25 seconds. I'm like, that can't be what we're doing. I don't know what it read before. I didn't even notice it. Oh, you know what? It is 2 seconds. That S looks like a 5. I'm sorry. Okay, all right. All right, thanks, sir. Okay, I'll ask about the charge. Do you see any reason that we need to come back out before, maybe the day before election night, or? Okay. Okay. Okay, yeah, I'm trying to get us plugged in by 3:30. I'm thinking they're gonna want to be over here for the 150s, and then we just stay plugged in. Okay. All right, thanks, sir. Bye. He says the signal was strong enough, and he thinks it's gonna be good enough for us.
Okay.
It's 100 megs for the whole hotel.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, you're plugged directly in. It normally would probably, you know, if you only need 7 megs, then you should be in good shape.
Okay. So the next two questions I have